Okay, so we've got one more group of speakers before lunch. So as we heard, entrepreneurship is actually an area where we have a lot of opportunity to think differently about the way we create good jobs. So up until now, we've been talking a lot about institutions like community colleges, adult schools, workforce boards, but now we want to hear a little bit more about business, and so we're going to be hearing from the Small Business Association. And also we have Sandra Sanchez from the Chancellor's Office will be talking a little bit more about how entrepreneurship can be baked into the community college work. So come on up.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. And to begin with, I want to give a shout out because it is National Small Business Week. Did anybody know that in this audience? Anybody at all? National Small Business Week. When we talk about equity and economic mobility, you can't get closer to that. So we're very honored to be joined today by Deputy Associate Administrator Victor Parker of the U.S. Small Business Association and the Vice Chancellor for Workforce and Economic Development at the state level. And so to that end, earlier we heard the Chancellor Oakley mention that we are smack in the middle of a transformational economy. And that, by definition, demands entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial spirit. So with that, I thought I'd start with a couple of statistics, because even though we know how important entrepreneurship is, I really want to impress upon us why it's so important when we discuss equity and economic mobility, particularly for our rural communities and our tribal lands. So there are 32.5 million small businesses in the United States, defined as 500 or less employees by the U.S. Small Business Administration, and that accounts for 99.9% of all firms in the nation. Additionally, small companies, small firms create 1.5 million jobs annually and account for 64% of new jobs created in the U.S. So basically, over half of all Americans work for a small business, essentially, right? So 66% of all employment growth over the last 25 years has been due to small business ownership, and that's a pretty powerful economic indicator. So keeping in mind that this country was founded on the principles of the entrepreneurial spirit, and that American Indians were the first entrepreneurs on this continent, and since then, immigrant populations from around the globe and those dragged to this country through colonialism have really engaged entrepreneurship to create prosperity for their families, and even more so, to create intergenerational equity and advancement, that economic mobility that is so very important. So that said, we know that entrepreneurship is important, but yet it's not defined as an occupation, nor is it even really a major that students can take in school. So with that, why is entrepreneurship important to be engaged and incorporated into all academic studies, both Gen Ed transfer and CTE? And we'll start over with Vice Chancellor Sandra. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me this morning. So to answer your question, really it's about the equity imperative that we've been talking about today, about building jobs with an equity focus. Specifically for rural communities, it's very important because in many of these rural communities, there may be less opportunities than there are in urban communities. They could be economically depressed. And so what do you say to your students who come to you with that hope of getting that livable wage job, and then those jobs don't exist in these rural communities? And so entrepreneurship is one way to support individuals who are looking to have career mobility and to create those opportunities within these communities. So it's really important that we infuse that into our curriculum. It's really important that we leverage the resources that are available in our communities to support the development of entrepreneurs. And it's really important because this is the only way we're actually going to move California forward for all communities in our state. And so making sure that we infuse that wherever we can, specifically in rural communities, is super important for the future of our workforce.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, you hit it right on the head, Vice Chancellor. I think one of the things we're doing throughout the country with the Small Business Administration is driving that equity focus across the board, not only for our rural communities, but for our urban communities as well. Because if we've learned, so many things from the pandemic from a small business perspective, but that focus and that divide, if you will, with broadband, for example, where we're trying to make sure that rural communities have access to broadband. And we've actually set up a rural task force across the country where we can actually have local district offices across the country really engage with those rural communities, because there is so much work to be done in those particular economic impact areas that relate to different market sectors that we can drive going forward. The other one is immigrant communities. California is a vast population and demographic of immigrant communities. And how do we better infuse them into our small business communities across the country? How do we better, particularly here in California, leverage those opportunities where we can expand, whether it's exporting, whether it's other types of restaurant, tourism, all the different great industries that we have right here in California, making sure those immigrant communities are tied is really a key area where we can, again, leverage that partnership with our community colleges across the state. And then I think the other piece of it is really, bringing that knowledge and visibility about entrepreneurship and infusing that regardless of the discipline. I think there's just so many opportunities where folks don't recognize the opportunity of entrepreneurship, and how do we better foster that and integrate that so it's a part of our everyday conversation and not something that has to be kind of forced, but it's what we automatically start thinking about. We have to think global. We have to think about those different things on a regular basis and make that a part of our everyday engagement with our communities and with our students.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it's so important to remember that exposure in and of itself is such a meaningful part of reducing those structural barriers, ensuring that our students of all types, right, our traditional students and our non-traditional students understand that this is an opportunity. And both of you mentioned rural areas, which we speak to our historically marginalized communities, our Black and African American, Hispanic and Latino, American Indian and Native Alaskan, Pacific Islander and Asian, but we also have to track persistent poverty. And that's now coming out in a lot of the federal funding announcements for workforce development, is addressing that persistent poverty in the rural areas. So we know that the U.S. Small Business Administration is the nationwide expert in entrepreneurship, and that you guys focus on the 3 C's, right? You focus on counseling, so knowledge about how to run a small business and start a small business. You focus on access to capital, which can be such a barrier for our historically marginalized communities. So we have these great things like microloan funds that come out of the SBA, right? And a lot of knowledge with regard to how to access capital in non-traditional ways. And finally, you focus on government contracting, which again is really, really cool, because that's how small businesses can become more resilient during times of economic recession, right? The 2 things that the federal government does when we're in a recession, they lower our taxes and they increase spending, right? So they hire more people and they hire those small businesses, and we know that the SBA has some really great certifications for historically marginalized communities. But so we're talking here about equity, right? And thus we must address barriers when it comes to that. And these barriers typically impact our historically marginalized communities far more over the years and over the decades. So to bring a couple more statistics in here, 20% of all small businesses fail in the first year. Over 50% fail within the first 5 years, okay? And they're dealing with a lot of challenges. One of the top challenges that we've heard thus far in this summit today is a lack of talented workforce, lack of access to that talented workforce. In fact, 52% of small business owners say that is their #1 challenge. And just to put this in perspective, I know we hear this all the time as educators, but in the 20th century, workforce wasn't an issue. It was all about infrastructure, right? It was, where's my transportation? Where's my energy connectivity, right? It's only been since the 21st century, and really since the Great Recession of 2008, that all of a sudden workforce development has become the #1 thing. Access to labor and access to talented labor is the #1 thing that can help our businesses, our small firms, plan for the future and plan for their investment. Another issue why small businesses fails, 42% of small businesses fail because of a lack of market demand. And that can be translated into a lack of knowledge of how to analyze one's marketplace, right? So, we know that the U.S. Small Business Administration, as we have heard all morning from the Chancellor's office and the community college, we're taking steps to remove these structural barriers. I know the US SBA has used policy tools to create set-aside funding for marginalized communities, and to create certifications like the 8A certification, which I'm sure you'll expand upon here, that really help prioritize marginalized communities when it comes to government contracting. And I really want to mention the most impressive thing that I've seen in my lifetime come out of the federal government, which is last year, in the midst of our pandemic, in the midst of such a bizarre time in our economy, when those with low educational attainment were the first to leave their jobs, right? They were the ones that had to go home to respond to those caregiving responsibilities. They're also the ones that got laid off first, right? Because we all know in this room that the number one indicator for how much wealth you're going to earn in a lifetime is educational attainment, period. And last year, the U.S. Small Business Administration, they actually prioritized review of applications for economic aid for those small businesses that were 20 or fewer employees. Which are those small businesses owned by our Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous populations? So with that, what are our biggest barriers when it comes to entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial skills, and knowledge in our communities? And we'll start with you, Mr. Parker.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, if we've learned nothing else with the various programs, particularly the Paycheck Protection Program, where we had to leverage our banks to assist us to get those much-needed funds to those existing businesses, we discovered that so many of our small businesses, they didn't have relationships with those banks. Access to capital was a much bigger problem than we really had thought about. And so we've kind of taken a step back and looked at our microloan program that we already have. So that's for $50,000 or less. And why that's so important is because many of our larger, or what I'm going to call traditional banks, they're not in the business of doing loans for $50,000. But think about how many small businesses can actually move the needle, create jobs, and expand and grow with $50,000. And so we're looking at ways that we can actually take what we call a microloan intermediary, not go through a bank, but we have community-based organizations, CDFIs, that can actually fund those businesses that really are looking for that smaller amount. And then we have another new program that's called a Community Advantage Program, and that's for $350,000 or less. Again, you have that growth trajectory of a small business. So if you start with that microloan program, the person then graduates into that Community Advantage Program and then graduates into our traditional programs. That's the way we start to build that equity, get folks in the mindset as entrepreneurs to actually start and grow and build their business credit. How do they better navigate all these different challenges that they have where they traditionally wouldn't have any of that direction? And that's where I think our resource partner network comes in. We are very fortunate. We have several of our small business development centers that are actually hosted at community colleges. And so thank you all for those community colleges. In fact,
How many colleges here hosted an SBDC? We got one in the room.
We got one. Well,
there
I do
we go.
know. But the important part, and actually that's how I met my good friend Eloy Oakley, because of Long Beach City College and one of our lead centers down for our small business development centers across the country. But those resource partners are really that conduit. So whether it's a small business development center, whether it's a women's business center, whether it's a SCORE chapter, and we have another new program that was funded by the American Rescue Plan called Community Navigators. And Community Navigators is really that concierge desk to reach those underserved communities. So instead of having some of our traditional community-related or based organizations involved, we've really taken a step back and said, where are these communities most connected? Is it the faith-based community? Is it the ethnic chamber of commerce? Is it perhaps some of the other organizations like the Urban League? So we have now brought in an entire cadre. There are 51 of these community navigators that are here that actually take care of things in terms of speaking in language, where we have such a barrier for language, particularly here in California. It's also about that cultural connection that we want to bring into our existing small business development centers, resource partner networks, women's business centers. And so making sure that connection is there and really trying to figure out how do we channel that entrepreneurial spirit that you see in a business owner each and every day. How do we get them to take a look at some of the things you talked about? Not only their passion for what they do, but how to do that effectively. How do they grow effectively? How do we actually make sure that a small business owner that may be the best at cooking and therefore has opened a restaurant, but how do they look at their market and make sure that they're able to address the needs of their community from that perspective and grow from that perspective? And then finally, taking a look at the different classifications, certifications that you referenced. Government contracting is a huge opportunity that so many folks take for granted. Granted, we have a variety of different programs, the 8A Business Development Program, we have a Hub Zone program, there's women-owned business certification, there's veteran certifications. We have a lot of certifications, but how to best leverage those certifications, and more importantly, taking a look and making sure you don't underestimate yourself. We've got to encourage our students and our aspiring business owners that they can be a part of that ecosystem. You don't have to be a big business to be a part of government contracting. When you talk about government contracting, it seems like an enormous feat, but it's not. For example, there's a fleet of government cars all over the place, federal government cars. Those things have to be repaired. We don't have to take them to the particular dealer. You can be a small mechanic, and you can actually have a government contract to service those cars. So it's about making sure we really incorporate and engage and leverage all these different certifications and educate our students and make them feel like they should be at the table, because that's what we're trying to drive, but also let them know they can do that. And so that's where I think the community college SBA partnership can really foster.
Fabulous, thank you. So that was a long list of resources, right, that we can harness that are already paid for by our tax dollars.
Yeah.
That's the coolest thing, right? We don't need additional funding in order to harness these resources. So Vice Chancellor, when we think about it in terms of internally to the community colleges, what are those biggest barriers to addressing entrepreneurial skills in the classroom and getting them out there to our students?
Thank you. I think one of the things, and it's been talked about today at numerous panels, is how do we break down the barriers that exist within our own institutions to be able to leverage those partnerships. I think in my experience in community colleges, and I've been in this system for 21 years, what I know is that workforce development was always siloed, separate. We worked with the SBDCs, but not very closely with our academic affair programs or our traditional academic programs. And so part of the challenge before us, I think, is identifying what is the infrastructure we need to build to facilitate access within our own institutions, and then, of course, to allow our partners into our institutions as well. One of the things that we're working on as a system office is really looking at how we effectively implement competency-based education. One of the things, if you haven't heard of it, if you're not doing it, that's the thing right now. We're really trying to make sure that we figure out a way to fund competency-based education in a meaningful way to allow for individuals along their career journey to come in and out of our system, to gain, to learn outside of our system, bring it into our system. So with that, coupled with competency-based education, is also credit for prior learning. How do we leverage the knowledge and the talent that those individuals who access our system already have and bring to the table? And how do we apply that in a meaningful way to a credential or certificate that helps them along their career journey? So how do we shift our structures internally to go from what has traditionally been, and I want to say, Amy spoke to this earlier, where we bring them in, we educate them, and then we push them out, and then we assume that we're never going to see them again, to a more fluid system where they're coming in and out of our system, learning along their journey, and how are we a partner in that? How can we help them become entrepreneurs, come back to our system when they need it, go out of our system, and maybe work with our workforce board partners. And so part of that is also the data and the data collection, and I think that was talked about earlier today as well, and how do we work with our partners externally to better understand the needs of the individuals that are touching our system. And the other thing that we're currently working on are updating our work experience regulations to facilitate work-based learning and those experiences that our students have. They come to us with a lot of knowledge. How do we, one, integrate work-based learning into pathways, right? So that that learned experience that they have actually counts towards a degree, a certificate, whatever they're trying to do. And looking at those regulations, they were 50 years old, so it was about time that we updated those. And so we're working on those types of efforts to make sure that the system has the ability to pivot and change and do what our students need in the moment. And I would say, one of the examples of our system's capacity to do this was obviously during the pandemic and moving to online education. So what we've learned is that we have created a lot of our own barriers, and so, part of our task before us is to make sure we remove those barriers and support students along their entire trajectory, not just at one moment in time. So I think those are some of the things we can do. I think the last thing is how do we ensure that our colleges are connecting well with our community college-hosted small business development centers. I worked at the SBDC in Long Beach, and so I'm very familiar with the work. And one of the things that I remember distinctly was that we didn't leverage that talent well. And when we did bring our SBDC consultants and experts into our business division, that created a unique opportunity and synergy to allow those conversations for how we adapt our curriculum to better meet the needs of the students, but also where the opportunities were for our own faculty to learn the latest and greatest of what's happening in business and industry. So it's a win-win. I think we have a unique opportunity at this time, and we should take advantage of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice Chancellor. I really appreciate a couple of things that you just noted there, right? It's the win-win for credit and non-credit and SBDC to engage with one another, because more than likely the result is going to be more enrollment all around, right? Better engagement with all of our community. And I just love that idea about using CPL, credit for prior learning, to merge the skills that an entrepreneur, that a business owner has who may have never thought about traditional academia or that degree, which is obviously going to help them as they move on with additional knowledge, and merging those skills with CPL to bring them into the system so that they can accomplish that degree and they can move right up that academic ladder as well. Great idea. We do, and we're gonna come here now and close it out here with something fun, something good, something that we could all use in application. I always like to make sure that our lectures are applied and our discussions are applied here. We know, what was the statistic? About 188% of millennials and Gen Zers want to go into small business compared to baby boomers. 188% compared to baby boomers. That's an insane amount. And I think something like 45% of them will actually start their business just because they so enjoy what it is that they're creating, and that's what brings in a lot of social entrepreneurship. So with this, I'll start with you, Mr. Parker, and then we'll end up with the Vice Chancellor here with a slightly different question. But first, what are the top 3 things that community colleges can do to promote successful entrepreneurial endeavors for both their traditional age and their non-traditional adult students? Top 3 things.
Top 3. All right, here we go. So I think, number 1, and to your point, we have seen a spike in new business starts. Just since the pandemic, despite all of it, we have seen, a tremendous spike, particularly here in California, with that growth. And we've seen not only that growth just in general, but if you look at the number of women-owned businesses particularly, that is across the country. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, California has the highest number of new women entrepreneurs across the country by state. But overall, we're seeing that continued growth, and that's where we really need to leverage. So one of the things we've done at SBA is we have started what we call Ascent, and it's sba.ascent.gov. And it is an actual online learning tool that we really are designed for women-owned businesses, but we can also sneak in there online as well. But we want to make sure that we start to leverage those online learning tools that we have right there at SBA, and how can we better integrate that with the community college system to address all the different topics that we need to address. And those journeys that we set up in Ascent are right in line with the different things that a small business owner would need to do to, again, channel that entrepreneurial spirit into that more of a business spirit. So that would be the first thing, is really starting with those online learning tools to make sure we address those demographics. The other thing is to enhance that connectivity, not only with the resource partners, because we recognize that it's not always easy to navigate the federal grant process to become an SBDC or a women's business center. But you do have district offices, and California is unique. It's one of the few states that has multiple district offices in the state. So there are 6 district offices in California. In fact, the Fresno district office is one of our top offices here in California. And really connecting with those district offices. And we can have SBA, my team is ready to come in and engage with your students. And I think we can do a much better job of infusing our programming with the community college environment. So I think there's really a new opportunity as we've all had to pivot to this not only online and virtual type of environment, but I think there's just an opportunity to really take a look at what are the needs of these new aspiring entrepreneurs and how do we best connect them with all the different resources to make sure they're successful, not only at the federal level, but at the local level as well. And then finally, I think really incorporating the entrepreneurship college pathway. Again, like we talked about, really looking at, regardless of the discipline, regardless of the course, how do we make sure that we make entrepreneurship really a part of the mindset as you start to look to go into any type of discipline? And how do you make sure that you can leverage that to be that entrepreneur that you can be? So I think that's how we can all work together and really drive that forward. Those have been our top 3.
Excellent, thank you. And I can't speak highly enough about Ascent. It is not your grandparents' online learning module, I can guarantee you that. It has infographics and footnotes. Like, that's impressive for us academics, right? And it's a great opportunity to leverage that in the classroom, right? That's one less thing that faculty have to be responsible for, right? Just leveraging it as a nice supplemental guide, a nice complement to what's happening in the classroom, and really brings in the modern statistics and lots of reference sources. Again, remembering due diligence is that one thing that all entrepreneurs need, and that ability to know how to research. So to you, Vice Chancellor, I'm going to shift the question just slightly to talk about how can we scale our best practices in our community colleges when it comes to incorporating entrepreneurship in our pathways?
Thank you. I think one of the primary things, and this was mentioned earlier as well, is we want to focus on impact and those things that actually make an impact for individuals, and not to the detriment, obviously, of the service that we provide, but really to focus on making sure that what we are doing is actually meaningful for the individuals that it touches. The other thing I think it was stated earlier that's really important is we need to question everything. We need to challenge status quo. Part of adapting and being entrepreneurial in our approach to education is making sure that we are self-reflective and that we learn from our pilots. So there is no death by pilot. But if we're going to do pilots, that we are intentional about them and making sure that we are learning from those experiences and we are elevating the voices and those opportunities for others to take advantage of and to not reinvent the wheel, to be able to scale. Just to give you an example of something that I did when I was working at a college was I brought in our business faculty to work with our non-credit division, which was, business credit, credit, non-credit, not for credit. It's all, it's like a cuss word almost. But wanting to make sure that, in the spirit of questioning everything, where do we find those opportunities to make meaningful impact? And so in my example, what I did was I brought in our business faculty to talk about their program because they had declining enrollment, and that's unheard of, right? Business having declining enrollment. I was like, what is happening? So we brought them and we had a conversation, and one of the things that we agreed upon is that students who are taking accounting courses, while that's really important to get a job, they needed to know QuickBooks. And so, small businesses, and I know this from my experience working with small businesses, QuickBooks was like a hot item. Everybody wants QuickBooks. And so I brought them into the room together to talk about what we could do with non-credit instruction and credit instruction. And so what we did is we built our QuickBooks classes in the non-credit side. And so we designed, and for those of you who know about our different pay structures within our system, we designed a career development certificate on the non-credit side. And so we took that career certificate in QuickBooks and we coupled it with our accounting classes. And so what happened, which was the big fear of the credit faculty, is they did not lose enrollment. The enrollment actually went up. So, we had individuals from the community, small business owners, who wanted to just take QuickBooks. And we had accounting students and business students who had to take accounting, but they also needed a job, right? And so what a better place to match both our economic development efforts and our workforce development efforts in making sure we were providing those opportunities for a very diverse set of individuals, bringing them all together. And then the synergies that happen in those classrooms, you're recruiting the credit students to go to the QuickBooks class and non-credits, and you're taking the non-credit students to go into the credit programs, and it actually increased our enrollment. And it has been hugely successful for the college I was at, and they continue to do this work because there's value, because the faculty recognize that this is something that is meaningful for students, but it also helps to keep them engaged and connecting with us, and also brings folks in from the community who never thought they could go to community college to see and experience this opportunity, but also get to meet our faculty and have those engagements. So it's really important that we question everything and that we try to think about different ways to approach how we do instruction, but also not be afraid. I think that a lot of what we do is based in fear of the unknown. And so how do we push on that? How do we push on that? We know everyone, I remember, didn't want to go online, and then we had to, and we did it, and we were hugely successful. So I think it opens that door to exploring the possibilities of trying something different, something that was long believed to be a negative thing could actually be a really good thing. And then one of the other things that we're working on is the I3 initiative. And really it's about how do we infuse entrepreneurial skills and mindsets into our general ed curriculum. How do we take a cross-discipline approach for different communities? Right now we're piloting, I know that's not a popular word, we're piloting this program with the hopes, though, of really learning from it in our efforts to continuously improve our system and really study ourselves to be better or the best that we can be, really learning from these pilots and how we can more effectively implement them, but really then elevate those best practices throughout our state to make sure that all colleges are taking advantage of those opportunities.
Excellent, Vice Chancellor. Thank you so much. I applaud you on your emphasis on flexibility, right? Because when we talk about equity and economic mobility, that's certainly what we need, that self-reflection, the courage to be self-reflective and to address those structural barriers that, like you said, were created 50 years ago. And everything has changed since then. Our whole world has changed since then. And I also must note that you're quite brave to bridge the non-credit credit divide. For many reasons, you could have been thrown off that bridge, but you did it, and you have a success story coming out of that. So thank you so much for sharing. For those of you who are live streaming, we did put the links for the SBA.gov as well as ascent.gov in the live stream. And if anybody else would like any more information, please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much. Please help me in thanking Mr. Victor Parker and Vice Chancellor Sandra Sanchez. Thank you. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you so much. I neglected to introduce my colleague, Alexandria Gonzalez-Wright, who you may have realized is a professor, and she teaches economics. So glad to be in class with you today. All right, so we're going to take about a 15-minute break so that we can get your food on the table. And then we're going to come back and we're going to be looking at the way you apply these concepts in particular sectors. Because just in the same way we have to tailor for different types of students, we need to tailor for different types of occupations and industries. So enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back in a little bit.